In this video, I'm going to be talking about narcissistic personality disorder and how that is something that I had and that I don't have any longer. So, I've talked a lot about my mental health on my YouTube channel and my physical health as well. And I'm going to be particularly just focusing on narcissism and my experience with that. As I mentioned, it is something that I have healed within myself now, within this last year. And in particular, the video about intrusive thoughts and healing my DID is where I really get into exactly how I did that. So that's kind of within that. So this video is more going to be like my experience with narcissism versus how I healed it and how I am now. So this is just a trigger warning for mental health in general and abuse. And this is just a harder topic for me to speak about because I did very unkind things intentionally, and it while there's many things that I've done that have been harmful to people, such as like people pleasing is harmful, it wasn't done with that intent. Not that that makes it any better or any less of an effect, but I feel the most shame and guilt about how I acted out of narcissism because I knew it was hurtful. And it wasn't so much that my intention was to hurt, but I knew that I was hurting people in how I was behaving. So how this started out is, for me, it's easiest to talk about it in relation to my dissociative identity disorder. So by the like around the age of 3, a caregiver I had programmed me 2 alters for DID. So I had one previously, just like kind of my core self, named Sarah, and then I had 2 alters that this caregiver programmed Void, who has had suicidal ideation and depression, and then Star, who was programmed to have narcissistic personality disorder. That is also something this caregiver had as well. So then I had a 4th alter at 4 that I named Little Lulu as like the caretaker or like gatekeeper. And that is really the only alter I ever fronted as. So that just, I'll kind of keep mentioning back to that because that's really how like I interacted with my narcissism, was like through the lens of a people pleaser, which is just very odd. And also I didn't realize I had DID till I was 25, and I had stopped acting out of a place of narcissism. So basically I had narcissistic intrusive thoughts along with all my other intrusive thoughts that I've talked about in other videos. But I never acted on them because the only thoughts I was ever acting on were thoughts of like anxiety and people pleasing. So while I had all of these thoughts, these narcissistic thoughts, I never acted on them in my childhood. And it just was really overpowered by me trying to people please, and I just had such deep insecurity and like not feeling like a person and not feeling like enough, that even though I had these really strong narcissistic thoughts, I felt really shameful and guilty about them because I'm like, oh, that's awful that like I think I'm better than other people and that I'm putting other people down in my head and that I think I deserve things that other people don't, or that I, just think I'm better than others. I'm like, wow, that's really awful that I think that. I'm a really awful person. And I almost felt I needed to like compensate for those thoughts because, again, I thought all the thoughts I had were me. So then I also felt just really worthless, like that I shouldn't really be alive, that I just didn't really want to be around. So it's like almost like I thought I had to make up for my narcissistic thoughts. So as I mentioned, I never acted on any of that as a child. And then basically in one of my relationships that I was in, because I dated from the age of 19 to 25, and next month I'm turning 29. So I dated for 6 years, and within one of these relationships that I was in, is again, I never fronted as my narcissistic alter. However, there was in one relationship I was in where I did actions for the first time from a narcissistic place. So, and there's no excuse for that. I did really awful, terrible things that I knew like were morally reprehensible. So, but to explain how I got there and like why I did these things, besides just being a narcissist, was, again, that doesn't excuse what I did, but to explain how I got there and why I did the things was I just didn't feel like valuable as a person. I didn't want to live, especially after high school, because I was like, well, I got good grades and I did what you have to do in society. Like, can I please go now? I don't want to be here. I never wanted to be here. And so I really like attached my identity to other people and dating. And it was just really, it was really tough. I didn't like what I thought like the purpose of life was, since I didn't want to be living, was, well, I think just the purpose of life is just to experience things. Like, that's it. And so I just wanted to like feel as good as I could feel, because I wasn't setting a strong foundation with people. I wasn't on like discovering who I was. I wasn't honoring my preferences or boundaries. I was just like wildly letting situations kind of get out of control. And so instead I was really just like living for the moment and not really caring if it hurt other people, which was just really awful. And I really think my narcissism played a part in this, in terms of thinking like, well, it doesn't matter if I hurt people, like, as long as they don't know that I'm doing something I shouldn't be doing, then it's fine, because I'm just living for me and I don't want to be here anyways. Like, I get, like, I was thinking I get to do anything I want, because like I got to 18, I got to be an adult, I did it even though I didn't want to live at least for 14 of those years. So like, what the hell, I'm just gonna live up life and just do things that feel good to me in the moment, even if I'm hurting someone else, right? So while my intention never was to hurt the person I was dating, like, I didn't go into it with a narcissistic mindset of like, oh, this is gonna hurt them and I'm enjoying this. So that differed a little bit for me from like typical narcissistic abuse. But instead, I still was acting from the lens of like my people pleasing alter, where I'm like, well, I know I'm doing something that's hurting them. I'm not willing to stop doing that. And I wasn't willing to like break up with them either. So just all around terrible choices I was making. So instead, I'm like, well, to avoid conflict and to not hurt them, I'm going to people please, and I am going to lie to them. I'm going to lie to them very heavily so they don't know that I'm doing something that would hurt them. So, and it's just so frustrating, because I've just gone through, this is just like the one thing in my life that I really regret doing. And growing up, when I was, around that caregiver who's also a narcissist and who intentionally programmed narcissism in me, you can be a narcissist and not be abusive. I think that's probably pretty difficult, because your thoughts are thoughts of like wanting to manipulate and control people very intentionally. So it also does bother me. I think sometimes the word narcissistic abuse gets like generalized to just abuse that's not narcissistic, as in like it's not intentional, like it's not someone trying to hurt someone, which doesn't diminish what's going on, because you can use similar tactics in abuse. But I view narcissism more as like well, actually being a narcissist, and then like trying to prop yourself up, because like it's born from like really deep insecurity. And so if you're coming from a place of like, I think I'm better than this person, I think I'm more skilled at this thing, and I'm enjoying causing them suffering and pain. So I think it really, at least for me and my view of it right now, it's about like the enjoying making someone else suffer is like characteristic of narcissistic abuse in general, versus other abuse that is just not like from a narcissist, though, even if it's like similar tactics being used. So growing up, I went through just really severe psychological torture from that caregiver, which was narcissistic abuse. It was very intentional. It was like this whole game they had mapped out. And what I did, like what my alter, who's a narcissist, wanted to do was like play the game with them. Like, I'm like, well, I'm even better at doing this than they are. I bet, you know, again, from insecurity. And it's like, if I wanted to, I could totally control the situation. I could do all this stuff. But I never once acted like that with this caregiver, because I thought it would be giving them like the satisfaction of like getting to me. And so I never acted out a narcissism around this caregiver, even though I had thoughts of doing so. So instead, I would just really heavily dissociate, like as a coping mechanism, and then I would people please. So I never, with this caregiver, I never, this is just also like difficult to talk about. I never really stood up for anything, like, except one. There's one thing I stood up for, but everything else I just completely lied. So it like taught me how to lie really convincingly as well, to avoid conflict. So I wasn't lying out of narcissism to try to like beat this person at their own game. I was lying out of people pleasing and trying to avoid conflict. So like this person could like cry on command, and was more like a snake, like very charming, like never really got angry, never yelled, not like a bull, but like a snake, like so charming, would cry and just tell me I was lying constantly when I wasn't lying. And so like after these conversations, I would to myself have to reprogram everything like in the last few hours that just happened, to like make sure I had my reality straight, because it was just complete, like my phone cut out there. But what I was saying basically was that when I was having conversations with this caregiver, I had to like reprogram my mind, because in order to like people please and avoid conflict and not argue with this caregiver, I would teach myself how to lie about everything, to like say things that they wanted me to say, basically. And that would kind of like prevent me trying to like act out a narcissism to their narcissism and like try to beat them at their own game. So, but what this really taught me was like how to lie very effectively, which I realize is what they were doing as well. It's like you can lie at like a physiological level where you fully believe the lies you are saying so that they're convincing. So, you know, in a way that your eyes don't move a certain way, you're not sweating in a certain way that you would if you're lying, and you completely can convince yourself of your lies so that they are effective and believable. So, I believe that's what narcissists do a lot of the time. And while the caregiver was doing all these lies with the intent to harm me as much as possible psychologically, at this time with this caregiver, because I wasn't acting out of my narcissism, who like also wanted to do that, but I was acting out as a people pleaser to avoid conflict, but still with this mindset of like, I'm going to lie as well as I can to avoid the conflict. because they just were upset with me anything that I would do. So I would lie about things to try to get out of the conversation as soon as fast as possible, basically. But that was really damaging to me as well, because then afterwards, not only was I dealing with all the things they were trying to make me believe I was lying about, but I also was dealing with everything that I made myself believe that was a lie, to try to not have as much conflict as possible. So that was just extremely mentally exhausting throughout my life as a child. So that's kind of my background as that. So now back to in this dating relationship I was in, where I was doing something unkind and I was lying about it to who I was with at the time. And so I already had this like built up terrible skill of being able to lie extremely convincingly, which before I was doing for good, right? Because I was trying to just endure this abuse from this caregiver without using, like, I guess I thought it would use even more mental energy to try to like put stakes in like beating them at this game. Instead, I'm like, I'm just gonna remove myself as much as possible, but still like from a lying perspective, because it felt too vulnerable, I guess, to tell the truth. I don't know. It was really complicated, but basically what I would do is like these same tactics that I saw, this caregiver doing to me, I did in this relationship with this person I was dating, where I was lying about this thing I was doing that was not morally right. And it was just really awful what I was doing, what I was choosing to do, where I would do the same things that caregiver did, basically, where again, I was lying not to protect myself as I was before, but I was lying to, in like a twisted way, like I thought I was protecting this person by not saying how I was hurting them. So again, it wasn't like I was trying to hurt them, like typically it is for narcissists. I was trying not to hurt them. But for the first time ever, I got this mindset where I'm like, wow, like I never acted this way with this abuser, but like I felt in a very narcissistic way, I'm like, I am so good at this. Like I am so good at lying. This is so believable. Like I am just the best. Like this is incredible. Like I probably would have been able to beat, the caregiver narcissist in their own games if I actually tried. Like it felt like I gave up all of that in my childhood of even like trying to control the situation in that way. So now as an adult, where I didn't really care that I was hurting myself and not being kind to myself, and it's like I justified it because I'm like, well, I'm trying to not hurt the person I'm with by not telling them the things that I'm doing that are unkind. But I'm like, internally, as it was really feeding my narcissism, because I was like, it was like I finally get to control the situation in the way I always wanted to as a child, but my like people pleaser self like wouldn't let me, basically, because that's who I was fronting as. But it's like the people pleaser version allowed, I don't know, was still fronting this whole time, like when I was in this relationship. But I don't know. It's a bit hard to explain. But I felt very much like, I felt very in this grandiose way, like I was just like better than everyone else because I was able to lie in this convincing way. And I would like, cry on command and like basically make this person feel terrible for even questioning me or doubting like my actions. And that just filled me with a lot of pride, I guess, because I'm like, wow, I can get away with anything, basically, is what it felt like. And it was just so awful. And I keep mentioning it's just really difficult to speak about and like admit to myself that that was kind of my mindset in this, because it's just the only time in my life where I was doing something cruel and unkind that I knew was cruel and unkind. Um, so that's kind of how narcissism showed up for me. Again, where I wasn't, not that it made it any better, I wasn't trying to hurt someone in the typical way like I experienced as a child with the narcissistic caregiver. I was trying not to hurt someone, right? With which obviously the kind thing would have been to not be dating that person or not be doing this unkind thing, right? But I just felt really selfish where I wanted like the security of being with this person while doing these unkind things I was doing as well. It was incredibly selfish. It was incredibly like personally unfulfilling as well for me, in terms of I just didn't feel safe. And it was like the more I did that as well, like the less valuable I felt as a person. Like I'm like, well, now I'm just like a bad person, which I don't really, I believe there's, good and bad actions people can take, but not really good and bad people personally. So like after that, after I afterwards, I eventually did feel like I stopped doing that, and I felt like, well, I need to tell this person the truth because I wanted to be with them, and I stopped doing these unkind actions. But the rest of that relationship in particular was just really awful because while I already had a really hard time as a people pleaser, stating my preferences, stating my boundaries and having boundaries at all, after that, it felt like I deserved for them to be unkind to me in any way they were because I was intentionally unkind to them, or like my actions in the relationship were unkind. And it felt like I deserved to be punished for that, basically. So that was just a really awful way to stay in a relationship where, not that that person ought to ever forgive me for what I did. However, it felt like I deserved to be punished for what I did instead of like me choosing to leave the relationship, right? Because I felt like they never really could forgive me, which again is not something, that I think I ought to have had from them. It was just we stayed together a lot longer than I think we ought to have, and it was very unhealthy. And at least while I was like in that relationship, it's like I couldn't forgive myself for a long time. And once I finally did at least start to forgive myself for what I did, and then I started to have boundaries, things just really fell apart after that. Because that's not really like the foundation that like I set this relationship up on, was like honesty and authenticity. And so again, it felt like I had to try to make it work out as long as possible, because I'm like, well, if I can grow, like if I can have done all these awful things and I still at that time, all the narcissistic intrusive thoughts that I'd always had, at least since the age of 4, they were still with me. I just, as I always had beforehand, I chose not to act on them, and then afterwards I chose not to act on them again. It was just for this window of time I was choosing to act on them. And so I knew it was possible, like, to be a narcissist and not act on the thoughts that I was having. And so I'm like, well, if I'm able to have a lot of distressing things going on, but not act on them and grow as a person, it felt like I had to give the person I was dating time to do that too. I'm just like, well, we can just grow together. You know what I mean? Like, even though you've done a lot of things to hurt me as well, I know I've done hurtful things, and I know I can grow and change and learn. So, like, I know someone else can do that too. So, I was just with this person longer than it was working out because I thought I like owed it to them or like I was almost just trying to force them to change so that we could both be like healthier together, instead of just, admitting that it wasn't really meant to be. Um, so that was like the bulk of my experience acting out of a place of narcissism with the unkind things I did, and then as a people pleaser, trying to lie about it to not hurt the person. And it was just really a mess. And it's just the one thing in my life I really, really regret. And it wasn't until after I stopped dating, so after this relationship, that I even recognized I had DID. Because DID is something that you're not really supposed to figure out you have, because it's your mind's way of coping with things. So I feel like maybe it was really different for me that I had all these other alters, and I never was fronting as my narcissistic alter, even though the thoughts were like constantly there. Because one time I did record like how often, like maybe a year after I found out I had DID, I recorded how often I was like switching between them in terms of what thoughts were coming through. And it was like in a 30-minute span, I switched like 150 times. So like several times a minute. So that's why like all the alters thoughts were basically constantly there, but I was only fronting as the people pleaser. And then that window of time with that person was the only time I acted out of my narcissistic thoughts. Again, which doesn't at all excuse that I did choose to do that, right? So after that, I'll just kind of wrap up with things, but not really fully explain how I healed from that, because I did that really solidly in my like intrusive thoughts and DID video. But basically, I spent a long time like, well, what I did and how I figured out that I had narcissism was that once I realized I had DID, I started like separating the alters, because it was just all a big jumble in my head. And then I named them, and I was like journaling with them. And it wasn't until I got like figured out how to even separate them in general, because all my life I just never even like listened to the intrusive thoughts. Like I just try to push everything back as far as possible and like not think about it. It's just so unbearable and painful. So once I did that, because I could journal like as one alter at one time, which was so amazing, because again, every minute all of them were communicating with me. So now to be able to journal for even a few minutes as just one alter, it's like I could hear their voice for the first time. Not that I was literally hearing voices, but it's like I could have a solid train of thought, which was so painful, specifically with the narcissistic alter, because that was the alter I felt the most shame and guilt about, because I'm like, wow, these are really awful thoughts. Like the rest of my alters don't feel like this, and me as like my higher self doesn't feel like this. So it was like, it was the hardest to admit that those thoughts were there. And then what happened is I took like these, you can look at the diagnostic criteria. And so I did that. There was like this test in particular, and I did that with each of my alters separately. And that's when I really learned how they differed in terms of mental health. And because anytime, if I were to take a narcissistic, diagnostic, actual test or quiz beforehand, it wouldn't turn up that I'm narcissistic, because the thoughts would be there, one of the alters, but then the three other alters would have thoughts that counter that. And so overall, I would answer in a way that isn't narcissistic. So never before could I even recognize narcissism within myself, because it wasn't like prominent or like dominant in terms of the other alters don't have narcissism. So when I was able to isolate that alter and take the quiz just from their perspective, it was narcissism off the charts. It was just full, it was just really strong. Like every answer was like the most extreme you can get, pretty much. And that was, again, just so hard for me to even like admit. It was so shocking and jarring to me, and just, I mean, devastating to me as well. I'm like, damn, I felt like just like an awful person. So it also took a long time to filter through that shame and guilt, and to really, it felt awful to look at my past and that dating history from a narcissistic lens as well, because it felt like if I did that, it was like excusing my actions and behaviors, which were just awful. And so it was hard for me to even admit that, because it felt like, well, I can't be kind to my narcissistic self because they have awful thoughts. But I realize now, loving everything, everyone, all thoughts, doesn't ever mean excusing them. It means validating that any thought, any feeling is valid. That never validates the actions that people choose to take, regardless of what thoughts or feelings they have. So it came from that point of really loving myself that I was able to like accept this in its fullest. And I talk about this more in the intrusive thoughts video, but like for me, like I finally felt safe enough to hear these narcissistic thoughts in full. And when they would say things of like, we're better than other people, and other people don't deserve what we deserve, instead of trying to like argue with that and say, well, actually that's not true, I understand you feel like that, however, that's really unkind, because I just already so solidly for myself personally just knew that was unkind. So like even saying that to myself just made my narcissistic alter really defensive and like double down and like, and say like, well, actually it is true because whatever. So instead, the way that really helped me, and this was like 2 or 3 years after I figured out I had narcissism and DID, where when I was really heavily, for about a year ago, really heavily listening to all my intrusive thoughts and talking to them, how I talk to my narcissistic intrusive thoughts in particular is that I talk to them, they would say something of like, we're better than other people or something like that. And I would say to them in a very loving way, reparenting myself, I am so sorry you're going through that. I know you, right? So I might just say that, like, I'm so sorry you're having such a tough time. And like immediately defenseless, like melts me. I'm like, oh my gosh, like my alter's like, you care about me. Like, I don't have to like have this front. And sometimes if I was feeling open to it enough, right, I could say to my narcissistic alter, like, again, I'm really sorry you're going through that. I know you're feeling really insecure about, XYZ. Because that's the reason, like, for narcissism, like this deep insecurity. Sometimes when I said that at the starting to my narcissistic alter of like, well, I know you're just really insecure, they would double down, and the thoughts would be more like, well, no, I'm not insecure at all, I just actually am better than everyone. So if I got any intrusive thoughts from any alters, if I got any defensiveness or pushback, I would fall down and more just say like, I'm sorry you're going through that. And so really learning like how my alters like to be talked to, what really helped, and knowing that like it changes as time changes too. Like what helped in talking to my narcissistic alter beforehand wasn't necessarily like that's always going to work. So being able to be flexible when talking to any distressing thoughts you're having, and this isn't only for these more extreme mental health issues, but also now, like, even just everyone has thoughts of some type of stress, right, in their life, and knowing how to talk to yourself with that, either just let the thought flow by, don't even acknowledge it or really observe it, or say something really kind to it, or say, let's make an action plan, or do some shadow work and talk about, where did this thought come from? Let's dissect that. Let's look into that. Let's cry about it. Let's make some art about it, and just really nurturing yourself and being so gentle with yourself and being flexible with how you approach yourself. And so I really healed all my intrusive thoughts, including the narcissistic thoughts, about a year ago in the spring of 2025. But I still, like, on walks I would go on particularly, or maybe journaling, I would kind of check in with my different alters, ask them, how's their day going? How are they feeling? Is there anything they want to do that would make them feel really loved and adored and supportive? And so even I'd been doing that probably solidly, like, maybe it was like 2 years, like, figuring out to even hear them at all, and then 2 years of, like, really listening to them a lot, basically. Anyways, but even after spring of 2025, it wasn't, I would still talk to them regularly, and they would, kind of tell me what they would like to do. Like, they all had different particular activities that were more aligned to them, when before I just kind of viewed all those things as, like, me, and it all is me, right? But it was nice to separate it, so then I could give each alter a particular space and time to do something. And so it wasn't until the fall, maybe 6 months later, like late fall, where I realized I hadn't really felt inclined to, like, try to talk to my alters separately. And so I did that on a walk, and I was like, I felt like that wasn't even something I was really being called or compelled to do, but sometimes I do things that I don't feel are most aligned for me, more out of curiosity, and then I actually really learn a lot about myself when I do misaligned things, because I learn why it's not aligned. So I end up very grateful for those experiences. So I basically asked each of my 4 alters how they're doing, but more so, like, why aren't you really talking to me anymore? Because, like, my previous conversations with them would go like, how are you doing? Like, oh, I'm fine. I don't really want to talk right now. And they all seem very even keeled, all like the same temperament, when usually they sounded really different in my head. They had very different cadences, but they all just sound pretty the same now, which had never happened before. Because usually they would have a lot of feelings to express, a lot of feelings of anger and shame and guilt, and, like, anger at me for not knowing they were there before, not listening to them before, or particularly with narcissism, with actions I had done in the past in that relationship. And so in the fall of last year, 2025, I finally asked them, I'm like, why aren't you really talking to me anymore? Why do you just always say you're fine? You have nothing to say to me. There's no activities particular to you want to do anymore. Like, not that I wasn't doing those activities anymore. It's just I wasn't, like, dedicating them to an altar and, like, putting myself in the headspace of one altar for the duration of it. And so I asked them all, and they're like, and this was so shocking to me, they basically all said, when you talk to us now, you're just remembering, like, the memory of us, but we're not here anymore. We are all integrated now. So that's why you're not getting separate responses from us. And we just say we're fine and we don't have anything to say to you. And this was so incredible for me, because my intrusive thoughts had stopped. March, April, June, like by June of 2025. So this was like November of 2025. So I didn't have any narcissistic thoughts anymore. I didn't have any thoughts of depression or severe anxiety, or people pleasing or anything. So I didn't really have those thoughts anymore, but I still was trying to communicate with my alters, because I didn't really even conceptualize the idea that I ever wouldn't, because, like, I'd worked so hard to talk to them, and I think it was really important that I never intended to like get rid of the thoughts. I never intended not to be narcissistic or like not to have that disorder. I very much intended never to act on those thoughts again, but it wasn't my intention to integrate. It wasn't my intention to get rid of the thoughts. It was my intention to just love and nourish myself as fully as I could. And so, at least for me, I think it was really important that I went into that experience not trying to fix myself, because I think that would have caused a lot of defensiveness of like, oh, you're trying to get rid of me, like from the altars. And so because I had no goal of healing DID or healing NPD, I had no goal of that. I just went into it with full love and acceptance of like, if this is something we're going to deal with the rest of our lives, so be it. I'm just here to love you and support you the best I can, right? I'm here to love and support myself the best I can. But in the fall, again, even though the thoughts had gone away, I talked to my alters, including the narcissistic one, and it's not there anymore. Like I don't have narcissistic personality disorder anymore. And it's just so incredible because it's something I thought I would live with for the rest of my life. And if you're curious about how I healed it in particular, again, the video about intrusive thoughts and healing my DID more fully goes into that, but just with all intrusive thoughts, and I didn't really expand upon my narcissism in general. And it just feels really relieving to share this part of my life, and really just to know that you're not your thoughts. You are more so what you choose to act on, right? And so to really own up to any time in your life that you were unkind in this way on purpose, but also for my other alters who were more like people pleasers, and that's, I'll talk about that fully in a separate video, is that's really unkind too, and is actually really harmful even though it's not intentional, right? And so to just have unconditional love for yourself, forgive yourself for everything, and hold yourself responsible for every action you've ever done. It's not like you have to feel guilty to hold yourself responsible. You can forgive yourself, and being responsible is taking accountability and changing your actions. And so in that, even if someone does have NPD, it can be really difficult, and probably even more difficult not to act on than my situation, perhaps, because again, I had other alters who didn't have DID that were fronting. However, I just know from this experience it's possible to have those types of really distressing thoughts and not act on them. And that doesn't excuse acting on them, but that there is hope to heal from this personality disorder. And as awful as the time as I have had with it, I'm really grateful for this experience because I realize it's taught me so much compassion for other people, just this universal love that I've always held for other people personally. But I realize now that while I won't excuse certain actions or behaviors towards me or other people, I have so much compassion because I understand from personally doing such unkind things and healing from it. I understand why people act the way they do in a sense. Maybe I'm not having the exact same thoughts or haven't done the same things they've done, but I feel it's just really given me so much empathy to understand why people act in certain ways, that I wouldn't really have that perspective if I didn't have NPD and I didn't act out of it. in part of my life. And so even though I did learn that lesson and I have that wisdom and knowledge now, that still doesn't make it okay what I did or acceptable, or it will never take away the harm that I did cause this person in my life. So overall, that's my story and my journey with narcissistic personality disorder. And I'm so happy for where I am now and happy to gain more insight going further. So I feel grateful for the experience. I feel hateful for the experience, and I always will really hate how I acted. And it's just a lot of emotions. It's just a whole amalgamation of different feelings I have for it, and it gives me a lot of strength of knowing kind of what I am able to overcome. And I hope it inspires other people going through a tough time to not necessarily, again, with the goal of overcoming, but with the intention of loving yourself to the fullest, no matter what that looks like, and knowing that a lot of times the journey of healing yourself looks very different than where you end up when you are healed, to the extent that that is possible for you. So I look forward to talking more about different aspects of my life and lessons that I have learned, and I wish everyone else a positive and loving healing journey with yourself as well.